Okay, recording now. This is lesson 3.5 on divisibility rules. Now, divisibility rules is a concept that you don't need to know at this point. However, they are useful to know, especially with long division questions, and also too, being familiar with the divisibility rules of certain numbers can help you determine the factors of a given number or if a number is prime or composite. So I'm going to take you through the chart, which you should have in front of you as you watch the video. Just as a reminder that at any point during the video, if you feel you need to stop and rewind to a certain point because you didn't understand what I said or you need to see an example again, please go ahead and do that. So remember, watch the video at your own pace. Okay, the first divisibility rule we're going to look at is the first one, the divisibility rule for 2. This is something you should know already. A number is divisible by 2 if the last digit, and you can guess what I'm going to write down, if the last digit is even. So think to yourself, what's an even number? Remember, all of the even numbers are the following, and I'm going to put it down in brackets underneath this description. So remember, an even number is 0, includes 0, 2, 4, 6, and 8. Okay? So I've given you an example here in the same box. 168, 84, 1,000, 746, and 22 are numbers that are divisible by 2 because the last digit in these numbers is even. Okay, so for example, if you look at the number 168, the last digit is an 8. Listed above here, we know that 8 is an even number, so a number automatically has to be divisible by 2. Now, I'm going to skip to other divisibility rules you are familiar with already. So I'm going to go to the other side of the page, and I'm going to go all the way down to the divisibility rule for 10, because this is also an easier divisibility rule to remember. So for the number 10, or a number is divisible by 10 if the last digit ends in 0. So again, the example down there, the number 100 is divisible by 10 because the last digit is 0. Okay, so those are two divisibility rules already. We've done the divisibility rule for 2 and the divisibility rule for 10. Now again, I'm going to skip and go out of order because I'm going to try and cover divisibility rules that you know first at the beginning. So let's go to the divisibility rule for 5, which is at the bottom of the front page. Now, the divisibility rule for 5 is the following, and again, this is something you may be familiar with. A number is divisible by 5 if the last digit is or ends in a 5 or a 0. Okay, so remember the difference between the divisibility rule for 5 and the divisibility rule for 10 is that a number is only divisible by 10 if the last digit is 0. But in the case of 5, a number is divisible by 5 if the last digit is 5 or 0. So if you look at the examples I gave you here, the numbers 255 and 100 are divisible by 5 because their last digits end in a 5 or a 0. Their last digits end in a 5 or a 0. Okay? So we've gone over the divisibility rule for 2, for 5, and for 10. Now, I'm going to go up to the top again, and let's do divisibility rule for 3. I find the divisibility rule for 3 to be very handy, okay? And I'll explain why, and it's a neat trick. I'll explain the definition here of divisibility for 3. A number is divisible by 3 if the sum of the digits in the number is divisible by 3. Now, this may not make sense yet, so that's why we have to do the example to show how this divisibility rule works. Okay, now the example I gave you is 168. If we look at 168 and we break it up in terms of its digits, we want to find the sum of the digits 1 plus 6 plus 8. Okay, so go ahead and add that up. And you can pause the video here before I give you the answer. So if you add up the digits of 1 plus 6 plus 8, you should get 15. Now, because the sum of the digits in the number is divisible by 15, if you take the number 15 and you divide it by 3, you get 5. That means it's evenly divisible by 3. Therefore, a notation for therefore is 3 dots in a triangle. Therefore, 168, the whole number 168, is divisible by 3. Okay, I'll explain this again. To find out if a number is divisible by 3, you want to take the sum of the digits in the number. So in this case, we took 1 plus 6 plus 8. We determined that the sum is 15. We know offhand that 15 is divisible by 3 because 15 divided by 3 equals 5. Therefore, you conclude that the whole number 168 is divisible by 3. Now, I'm going to jump to the divisibility rule for 6 because it's related to the divisibility rule for 2 and for 3. And it makes sense that we do this one next. Now, the divisibility rule for 6 is the following. A number is divisible by 6 if it is divisible by 2 and 3. So I emphasize both. The number has to be divisible by 2 and 3. Now notice I gave you the same example in the previous question. The number 168 is divisible by 6 because it is divisible by 2 and 3, but we're going to break it down and be more specific. Because it is divisible by 2, so meaning the last digit is even. Remember, it's an 8. And it is divisible by 3. Hope you can read my writing. So I'm going to put down 1 plus 6 plus 8 like we did previously equals 15, which is divisible by 3, which equals 5. Therefore, 168 is divisible by 3. Okay, so again, the divisibility rule for 6 depends on the divisibility of the number by 2 and by 3. So the number, if the number is divisible by 2 and 3, it's automatically divisible by 6. Now, We've covered that divisibility rule of 2 and 3 and 5 and 10. So I'm going to jump to 9 because 9 is very similar to the divisibility rule for 3. Now, a number is divisible by 9 if the sum of the digits, so notice this is very similar to the divisibility rule for 3, is divisible by 9 instead of 3. So, using the same example here, 549 is divisible by 9 because, again, we're going to break it up, 5 plus 4 plus 9, okay? So go ahead and add that up and pause the video if you want to. Okay, so what you should have gotten was 5 plus 4 plus 9 equals 18. You know that 18 divided by 9 equals 2, so it's evenly divisible by 9. Therefore, again, that symbol therefore, 549 is divisible by 9 because the sum of the digits is divisible by 9. That's what you can conclude. Okay? Now, let's go back to the other page and let's talk about the divisibility rule for 4. Okay? Now, the divisibility rule for 4 is the following. A number is divisible by 4 if the number formed, it's not the sum this time, it's the number formed by the last two digits is divisible by 4. It's not as cool of a trick as the divisibility rule for 3, but still it will come in handy. So again, is divisible by 4. So I'll repeat that. A number is divisible by 4 if the number formed by the last two digits is divisible by 4. So let's work with the example. The number 316 is divisible by 4, and notice I'm underlining the number formed by the last two digits. So in this case, we're looking at 16, okay? 316 is divisible by 4 because the number formed by the last two digits comma 16 is divisible by 4. Okay? So again, that's the divisibility rule for 4. You're just looking at the number formed by the last two digits. So in this case, it doesn't matter how big of a number it is. You can just look at the number formed by the last two digits and figure out if that's divisible by 4. If it is, that means the whole number is divisible by 4. Okay, let's go on to the next page and deal with the last divisibility rule, which is the divisibility rule for 8. It's a little bit tricky and it requires a bit more work. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the following. So a number is divisible by 8 if the number formed, similar to 4, but it's the number formed by the last three digits is divisible by 8. Okay, so for example, if we're looking at the number 568, well, there are already three digits here. Okay, this is where you're going to have to do some long division and some division because there's no real shortcut to do this. So if we divide 568 divided by 8, okay, we get 7 times 8 is 56. 0, carry the 8, 1. 1 times 8 is 8. So we know that the number 568 is divisible by 8 because the number formed by its 3 digits. Is divisible by 8. Okay, so that is divisibility rules for you. What I would do is I would make sure that you understand the divisibility rules, give yourself some examples, and try out the little tricks. What's probably new for you guys is the divisibility rules for 3, for 4, for 6, for 8, and for 9. Notice there's no divisibility rule for 7 here because it's not that straightforward. Okay,